And it's 11 o'clock, so I'm going to say welcome, everybody, and welcome to our Pondside Talk today, brought to you by Wet Plan. Just a few housekeeping rules to start off. You entered in mute mode, and so please stay muted and keep your cameras off just so we can save some bandwidth. Please use the chat feature, and if you haven't already been to one of our Pondside Talks, please put in your email address and your zip code. That information will not be shared with anyone. We'll just use it to invite you to future programs. And we like to use your zip code just to see how far we're reaching throughout Lee County and abroad. So you can also ask a question through the chat feature. You can also answer one by unmuting yourself and asking a question when Q&A time comes. Please be aware that we are recording this session. So if you do have your camera on, make sure you're real happy with how you look in that little box. Like I said, if you have a question at Q&A time, you can unmute yourself and we'll be able to hear you. Please be brief with your questions and respectful. So our Wet Plan program is brought to you by these organizations, and here with us today is Marlene Rodak from the Florida Native Plant Society Cocoloba chapter. I'm your moderator, Karen Miller, and I'm with GHD. We're an engineering firm. Maria Romero is here from Lee County Natural Resources. She's their TMDL coordinator. Ernesto Lasso de la Vega is with Pond Watch. He's the Pond Watch coordinator for the Lee County Hyacinth Control District. And Andy Tilton's here with Johnson Engineering. So today's speaker is Dr. Jerry Jackson, and if any of you are NPR nerds like I am, you've probably heard him talk on WGCU, and it's always fun to hear him talk about Out with the Wild Things. I'll let him tell you more about himself, and I will give control over to Dr. Jackson, and I will stop sharing and let him talk. So Dr. Jackson, unmute yourself and it's all yours.
Dr. Jackson, you want to unmute yourself. Dr. Jackson? Dr. Jackson, you'll want to unmute yourself.
There you go.
Perfect.
So I want to begin with an apology to someone, and I don't know who the someone is, who sent me an email some time ago that I never responded to because I lost the email. And they were asking about my favorite wetland plants or something like that. So you'll hear about some of my favorite wetland plants today, and I do want to apologize. What I'm going to talk about today is stormwater ponds in particular, and the roles of native vegetation in providing for their use by wildlife. And I'll begin though with something else, something that I think is very important for people to understand, and that's the nature and values of wetlands. A wetland, most people think of any body of water as a wetland. It's not. A wetland is wet land. It's dry part of the year and wet part of the year. It is not a golf course pond or a canal. Such bodies of water lack the amenities, diversity of structure and life, and seasonal resilience provided by true wetlands. By our actions, except for the Everglades, we have lost about 90% of Southwest Florida's wetlands. A century ago, the biggest industry in Southwest Florida was cattle ranching. And there were some really big cattle ranches, including the Babcock Ranch, which came along a little bit later. But this is what that ranch land looks like today yet. This is a wetland. It During the rainy season, the pastures are flooded. The cattle just wander around the pastures eating. They may get fungal growth on their hooves, but they do quite well there. And each year from late spring through summer, the land of Southwest Florida would be covered by a few inches of water, maybe a foot, maybe a little more than a foot in places, but just inches, connecting small streams and rivers that were flooding as a result of the rain. As the land dried, though, when the wet season was over, land creatures moved in to feed on the rich supply of stranded fish and other aquatic creatures. Dry land plants flourish, and new growth attracts insects and creatures that feed on new growth, and insects are, until the rains come, and then dry land life leaves, dies, or climbs stems of flooded vegetation. Then fishes and other aquatic creatures come into the wetland to find food and breed again. And wading birds and other animals come to take advantage of the fishes and their offspring. So basically, there were two peaks of productivity on these wetlands. One when the wetland was dry, one when the wetland was wet. And so it gave opportunity for things to breed at different times in different kinds of habitats in the same place as a result of the wetlands. But when we began increasing in numbers, we began draining the land to make room for our homes and roads, and trying to protect our livelihoods. And so we got rid of the wetlands. We stopped it in most places. Babcock Ranch still has some wetland areas, but they now have a city there that's growing. And in time, we will lose much of those wetlands too. Retention ponds, on the other hand, mitigate some losses of wetlands and protect us and our property from seasonal flooding and pollutants that are carried in the water that is running off the land. And this is a retention pond. You can see the vegetation in the background that's growing in the water. There's vegetation behind that that's growing on land. There are some stumps and other limbs out in the water, and they all provide amenities for birds and other creatures that make use of the wetland. What is it that can maximize the use of a stormwater retention pond by wildlife? I've tried to list a number of things. I'm sure I've missed some, but location is important. So the appeal of a wetland to wildlife isn't going to be very high if it's surrounded by buildings and it's in a city or something like that, unless it's in a park like Eagle Lakes Park. But surrounding habitat is important. The size of the wetland is important. The stormwater retention, size of the stormwater retention pond is important. Bigger is better, up to a few acres, but then if you get too large, it becomes a lake, and you've got nothing but water out there over much of the land, and it loses the appeal to wildlife, except right along the edge. Shape is important. Irregular is better. I happen to live near a canal, and the canal runs north-south, and we get a lot of winds that come straight out of the north or straight out of the south, and there is no getting away from the wind if you are wildlife in that canal or near the canal. So having an irregular shape always provides some shelter for wildlife during high winds. Contours of the bowl is important, and this is something that is not dealt with wildlife in mind. Steepness of the sides, variation in water depth are important. And if you have very steep sides, it's going to be tough for wildlife to make use of that pond. If you have water that is very deep in the center and very shallow along the outside, it's not the same as having a wetland, because a wetland is going to be continuous shallow water, and the shallow water in a pond, a retention pond, is usually shallow only at the very edge, and then it gets too deep too quick. So if there are small fishes that a heron or egret might want to eat, along the edge. If it misses, the fish just goes into deeper water and the bird can't get to it. Vegetation around and in the pond is important. What species are there, the density of those plants, the structural variation in the plants, whether it's tall or short, whether it's got lots of branches or few branches, whether it's evergreen or not, and the proximity of the vegetation to the water is important. It's real important to have some vegetation right next to the water. And for some species, it's important to have limbs that are hanging over the water, and I'll explain that in a bit. Diversity and location of inanimate objects, large rocks, partially submerged dead limbs can be extremely important for wildlife, and I'm going to show you some examples of that, but it's really amazing. One dead branch out in the middle of a pond can make all the difference in the world to the birds, for example, that are using it, the pond, or the turtles that are using the pond, because that branch out in the water provides a perch that is safe from any terrestrial predator, and it gives them a chance to be out in the sun to fish or to just to bask in the sun. Here are the two illustrations I have from water treatment engineering firms, stormwater treatment engineering firms. The one on the left is a stormwater retention area that is probably just been constructed, but it's real long and real narrow. Its sides are way too steep to be optimal for attracting wildlife. There's no kind of emergent vegetation, nothing else that's there. It may change over time, but the steepness of it is what's important and what is very common. That one minimizes the amount of land area that is used by the pond, and it was never intended to be for wildlife. But the one on the right is also a water retention pond, and it was also one that was on the website of an engineering firm that does water treatment ponds. And you can see it has an irregular edge, it has emergent vegetation, it has a diversity of vegetation along the edges. It has some height differences. There's even an osprey nest on the right side on that tall tree that's standing there. Both of these water retention ponds are likely effective in dealing with stormwater problems for which they were designed, but only the one on the right should be considered or could be considered as also a boon to wildlife and a boon to the diversity of life in that particular area. The one on the right obviously takes more space. It's obviously a larger pond too, but it is a place where the water can be purified slowly and returned back to the system. Wildlife attraction to a water treatment pond or a water retention pond is highest when there are extensive shallow areas. And that's not usually a part of water retention ponds, but it can be. You just have to make it a little bit bigger and provide the shallow areas. The slope of the bottom for wildlife should be very gradual to attract shorebirds and waders. The black-necked stilt really has long legs, but he can only go so deep, even though he just feeds on the surface, gets the mosquito larvae and other larval insects from the surface. Spotted sandpipers, on the other hand, the black-necked stilts nest here. We have them nesting at Eagle Lakes Park. Spotted sandpipers are only migrants through here, but we get them in the spring and in the fall. And when they're here, they'll pick a pond that has an open shoreline. They like to be able to walk on land, and they'll walk along the edge and feed. Solitary sandpiper is also a bird that is only a migrant here, but we have them for several weeks every year in spring and fall. And they like shallow water with emergent vegetation coming out, and they wade through that water up to 2 or 3 inches deep. and find their food there and consume a lot of harmful insects and even occasionally a small fish. Eagle Lakes Park, shown in this drone's eye view. My son is the photo editor for the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and he has a drone license to take photos for newspaper stories. And he took this one for me at Eagle Lakes. It shows the central part of Eagle Lakes Park, where there are ball fields and other things, lots of sidewalks, lots of vegetation, some of which is exotic, some of which is native. And it also shows to the right, here you can see the southeast pond, which is very large and very barren along the edge. Here is what I call maintenance pond, because here's the maintenance building here. Maintenance pond is relatively large. Then down in this area is what I call roost pond and the tennis courts. And word of warning, if you're into building water retention ponds, don't put in a tennis court right next to it. On the other hand, if you're into tennis and you need some tennis balls, you can come out to Eagle Lakes Park, and you can always find a dozen or more every time you come out, because they hit them into the water and they float on the surface until they come to shore, and you can just pick them up and use them if they're any good. And some of them are, some of them aren't. But there are also two other lakes in the park, back in this area and over in this area, the North Central Lake and the West Lake. And those are part of a wildlife preserve that is a part of the park. And there's a tremendous diversity of habitat in these areas, such that we get a lot of birds breeding in these areas that come over here to the Southeast Lake, which doesn't have that vegetation distribution or quantity or diversity. And but they get a lot of fish out of this one, because there's a population of blue tilapia in there that is very, very productive. Here is an aerial view of the West Lake of the Eagle Lakes Park. And this is 41 in the background, right along in here. And the rest of it is an area that is within the lake boundaries, and you can see the diversity of vegetation, some floating vegetation, some on land, some emergent vegetation in the water, and some good vegetation along the shore, but it's scattered, and it is provides opportunities for isolation of individuals and nesting of individuals out there. So we get a lot of diversity of life in this area. Structural diversity of pond habitat is sometimes as important as plant diversity. Whether the structures are man-made, such as this water control facility on the Southeast Lake at Eagle Lakes Park, or whether it's a fallen branch that's partially emerged from the water at the Roost Pond area of Eagle Lakes. I can't say enough for having bits of vegetation, old branches that have fallen down, sticking up out of the water, because the birds love it. And so do turtles, so do snakes, so do other kinds of wildlife, because of the safety it provides them and the view that it provides them of anyone or anything approaching them. These are brown pelicans, immature ones. There are 3 of them here. There's 4 of them here. And there were 4, there's 5 of them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 brown pelicans there. There were 4 up until 2 days ago at Eagle Lake, it's 3 days ago now at Eagle Lakes Park, when a big alligator ate a brown pelican in Maintenance Pond. Even grassland birds like a perch to sing from. And so if you've got nothing but mowed grass around a retention pond, don't expect to see many birds there, or much other wildlife for that matter. I've been doing surveys of wildlife along a 2-mile stretch of Collier Canal, which runs right along 951 for 3 years now. And during those surveys, I've seen one snake, just one in 3 years. And I survey that canal almost every day, but there's no hiding places. There's not much for snakes to do or to be at, and there's nothing but mowed grass and highways. But there are a lot of turtles, especially soft-shell turtles, and there is a surprising diversity of birds that we found along the canal, but none that nest there. Alligator flag is one of my favorite wetland plants, and it's one of my favorites for a lot of things, mostly for the diversity of wildlife that it attracts. Blue-gray gnatcatchers, which are little tiny birds, you find up around those flowers catching insects all the time. Purple gallinules nest in alligator flag. Common gallinules will get into the alligator flag. A number of bitterns will get into them, both the American bittern and the least bittern in there. Herons and egrets get into alligator flag. And the characteristics of it are in part implied by the name of the scientific name of the plant, Thalia geniculata. That word geniculata comes from the same Latin root as our word genuflect. And this was named by a botanist with a sense of humor because he saw that alligator flag has bent knees, and that's what geniculata refers to as bent knees. And their bent knees are on the flower stem. If you look at the flower stem, you can see that it is zigzag shaped, and the flowers come out at intervals along there. The bend allows them to be separated far enough apart, and the seed pods will be far enough apart that they can mature and grow. But this is a plant that is pollinated primarily by a wasp or a bee that digs holes in wood and lays its eggs in there. And it is one of the few animals that can penetrate to get the pollen out. Other insects are not strong enough or haven't figured it out, but that bee has. And if you look close at alligator flag, sooner or later, you're going to see a pattern like this on a leaf. You'll see a row of holes starting on one side with a little hole, and the holes keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as you go across. And you can see there's another hole here that is just started to go across, and another row up there. What happens? How do you get a perfect row of holes like that in a leaf? And the answer is simple, but most people don't realize it. The holes are made by an insect that is living inside a curled up leaf. The adult moth goes in, lays its eggs in here, and the eggs hatch, and then the young are protected inside of that alligator flag leaf that's curled up, and they begin eating their way out, going through layer after layer of leaf as they do. And by the time they get out and the leaf is full grown, you can see the row that goes across there. And the insect that does that is this little insect, which is a native Floridian, but it's also found down into Latin America, the Brazilian skipper. And it feeds on, it's also known as the larger canna leaf roller, telling you something also about alligator flag. It's related to canna lilies, although it's not a lily. And it has caterpillars that are nearly transparent. They're real thin-skinned and they don't have hairs on them. But this is a common moth that we have. I'm sorry, it's not a moth, it's a butterfly, it's a skipper. And you can identify a skipper as the type of butterfly that it is by the antenna that has a little hook at the tip. And it also holds its wings up over its back and slightly extended. It doesn't spread them out completely most of the time. Other things live in the alligator flag too. Green tree frogs find their food there, and they'll even get down inside and feed on the caterpillars of the butterfly. Salt meadow cordgrass and Spartina patens and spike rush are two plants that are important, and they do sort of the same thing. They cover a large area with relatively dense vertical stems, and a lot of different kinds of creatures will use these areas of Spartina and spike rush both to nest in and to take shelter in. And right now at Eagle Lakes Park, this pair of common gallinules has a nest, their fourth nest since August that they've had, and fourth successful nest. So far, this one's successful. 3 of them have hatched and raised young. I like spike rush because it's easier to see things in it, especially if the thing you're looking at has a red bill. But they build a platform out of dead spike rushes in the middle of it. And this is an expanse that is about 10 feet wide and 30 feet long with spike rush. And you really need an area about that size in shallow water in order for there to be nesting activity. But even if you just have a little bit, the wildlife will take advantage of these plants for shelter. Coastal plain willow is a tree that grows really fast and it can take over a pond. And there are other plants here that can take over also. And so some management may be needed in order to maintain both the habitat for wildlife and achieve the job that you want the pond to be doing. Little blue herons, during their first year, are white in color. And this is a young bird. This was in December. And so it was one that had hatched in the spring. And it's in Carolina willow. And they use that for perching. They also use it for nesting. There are lots of insects attracted to the flowers of milkweed bug. And milkweed bug is one of them. And the flowers are blooming right now, and a lot of them have already gone to seed. So it's very early in the season, providing something that is attracting insects and also something that is providing for insects. Bees are also taking advantage of this right now. Myrcene is also one of my favorite plants. It is a native. It's native to the Caribbean and South Florida. Its closest relatives, however, are from Africa. And it's interesting in that it's evergreen and that it has its leaves at the tips of the branches, and it has bare branches down below where the leaves are. And those bare branches produce the flowers, the bare part of the branch does, and the flowers then produce these little blue berries that are the fruit, and they may produce more than one crop in a year, and they're capable of producing the fruit relatively quickly. The berries are important wildlife food, especially in the winter, but also at other times of year. And when Hurricane Irma hit, I was watching Myrcene out at Corkscrew Sanctuary, and the hurricane took every bit of fruit off of these trees. They're low shrub, small trees, or high shrub, small trees, and it was all gone. And I thought, oh, it's going to be a tough winter for migrant birds. But within days, they were blooming again. And within a few weeks, there were a fresh crop of food out there. So plants continue because they need to survive too. Oh, come on. we got to go way back. Okay, so myrcene is a tree that can grow in sunlight and in shade, and it is small enough that it is pretty easy to deal with, to manage. It is somewhat prolific because its seeds are spread by the birds. It doesn't grow in well in the water, but it does grow in moist areas, and you see a lot of it around Corkscrew, for example. I have a lot of it in my backyard. It's also known as colic wood. Sagittaria is a genus that has a lot of diversity. We have at least 3 species that are common here in Southwest Florida. This is the biggest one, lance leaf Sagittaria. It's an emergent plant. It grows in the water or in wet soil, and it's an interesting plant. All of the Sagittaria, incidentally, look alike. The flowers look alike, but they're different sizes. They have different shaped leaves, and they have different habitats that they live in. One of the most interesting things about it is that every individual plant produces both male and female flowers, but they're separate. And the female flowers are always produced first. So here are the female flowers. You can see the female structure here, which is light green. That's the where the pollen is going to be deposited. And up here are the next batch of flowers, and those will all be male flowers, but the male flowers don't appear until after the female flowers have been pollinated. Lance leaf Sagittaria can grow to 3 or 4 feet and is very common, and it can grow in stands near shore. And it's a very important food plant for lots of insects. It's also an important plant for attracting insects that are food for a lot of birds and other wildlife. The common gallinule, for example, will catch insects near Sagittaria. Grass leaf Sagittaria is often no more than about 1 foot high, and it has leaves that look like grass. The lance leaf Sagittaria, which is also known as bull's tongue Sagittaria, has leaves that are shaped like the head of a spear. It's also called arrowhead. All of these plants are called arrowheads sometimes, but scientific name Sagittaria lancifolia is this species, the tallest one, the biggest one. Pig frogs are an animal that needs emergent vegetation such as Sagittaria in shallow water near shore to hide and wait for insects and other small animals. And this is a male pig frog, and it's got other vegetation that's coming up here, but you can tell it's a male because the eardrums right here are bigger than the eye. The eye is here, and the female has eardrums that are smaller than the eye, or the same size as the eye. It's only the male that defends a territory, and it's only the male that calls loudly, and he needs to be able to hear and judge the distance to where his competing males are. And the females just need to be able to hear him and go to him. So this is the male. You can tell the female by the smaller size of the eardrum. And live oak is Quercus virginiana, very common in Southwest Florida. And it's an important habitat for a lot of birds. This happens to be next to the tennis court. There's a tennis ball down here to prove it. Here's another tennis ball over here to prove it. Here's another tennis ball. Here, you can't take a picture there without getting tennis balls in the picture because they always end up there. But here is where the arrow is pointing, is an Anhinga. And you might ask, why did that Anhinga land there? It didn't land there. It climbed there, because Anhingas are birds that have an unusual molt. They lose all of their wing feathers at once, and so they can't fly for nearly 3 weeks. But they do have to find safety, and they find safety by climbing up in trees. And this is an example of what you should be thinking of when trying to manage for wildlife around water retention ponds. If you plant live oaks, don't worry if that live oak is leaning. Let it lean. Make sure it's leaning toward the water, because if it's leaning, the Anhinga can climb much easier. The Anhinga has claws on its feet that are like a woodpecker's claws. They're a half circle curvature, and they are capable of clinging to the tree trunk and walking up that tree trunk. And when they get up to the branches, they'll throw a wing over one branch to pull it up to the next branch, and so on. But they can climb, and they can very quickly go from the water up the tree and out to over the water. And because they can't fly, when they leave the tree, if they're leaving in a hurry as a result of a potential predator or something else, they belly flop into the water. And having a limb that branches over the water is important. And it's important for other things also, but that's one of the major things in Southwest Florida that is important about them. Live oaks also provide food and habitat for a diversity of wildlife, such as our endangered fox squirrels. We have two subspecies of fox squirrels in South Florida. The big Cypress Fox Squirrel is found south of the Caloosahatchee River. The Sherman's Fox Squirrel is found north of the Caloosahatchee River. And obviously that river is a barrier preventing each from going to the other side. And so genetic diversity has resulted in them having a different kind of fur that they have. The fox squirrels are endangered because, unlike our gray squirrel, which is very common, they have very large home ranges. Gray squirrels are mostly arboreal. They can readily cross a utility wire. They stay up in the trees and come down to the ground for food sometimes, but will very often go from tree to tree by jumping. And they have a home range of maybe 1 to 3 acres. The big Cypress Fox Squirrel and the Sherman's Fox Squirrel can have a home range of a few miles. And in order to get enough food, they have to go over land to find it, and they have to cross roads. And cutting of trees and clearing of for highways, creating roads has made it very difficult. Most of the fox squirrels that get killed are killed on the highway as they're crossing the road. Some are killed by predators out in the open, and they feed on a diversity of seeds, acorns, including the acorns of live oaks, but also other kinds of food too. They wander a great deal, and if you get to see one, you're lucky. I have seen one fox squirrel at Eagle Lakes Park. I have seen several fox squirrels at North Collier Regional Park, and they are no longer as common at either of those places than they used to be, because they have cleared trees away. They have pruned the branches of oaks. Live oaks have very dense vegetation and very intricately interlaced limbs on the trees. And so to protect the trees from being blown over in hurricane winds, people go in and open them up. And that makes any nesting bird or nesting squirrel vulnerable. It's just not good. If you've got young live oaks, my recommendation is don't prune them. Leave them as dense as they are for the wildlife, and replace them if you need. Bigger trees, it's different, but the birds don't normally nest in the bigger trees. And I think this is the last slide I have. So I would be glad to entertain any questions you might have. I focused mostly on the difference between wetlands and water retention ponds. but I'd like to focus on how water retention ponds can serve to protect wildlife that otherwise might have needed wetland areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. We do have one question that came in. Well, we had a couple questions, and our Pond Watch friend Ernesto answered one of them. But
Okay.
another question is, when does the Anhinga molt?
That's a good question, and it's one of the things that I'm studying right now, because we know that Anhingas molt at any time of year. They typically will molt, a lot of them will molt in late summer, early fall, but they can molt at any time of year, and you can see birds without any wing feathers at all at almost any time of year. And that may be an adaptation for helping to protect them from predators, so that the predators can't know that this is the time that all the Anhingas are molting. We can eat them all. You can find them all. The alligators watch, and it's very interesting when you've got an Anhinga that can't fly, they still have to get food, so they have to go back in the water, and they can swim very well and can normally avoid alligators. But if they are just going ashore and they don't have a tree to climb, 2 or more alligators will position themselves at angles on either side of the Anhinga, hoping to catch it as it goes back out to feed again. And they sometimes do. One of the other interesting things about Anhingas that is related is that Anhingas have a very long tail. Their tail can be a foot long, and that's longer than almost any other bird that we have down here in Florida. And you might ask, why do they have such a long tail? You might also notice that the end of the Anhinga's tail is light colored. It's light tan. The tail is black, and they don't spread their tail out when they're flying. They spread their tail out when they're swimming, and it helps increase their buoyancy and their ability to maneuver in the water. But it is also a protection against alligators. That tail is almost exactly the same length as the mouth of a 10-foot alligator.
Wow.
And so a predator like an alligator will normally only attack from behind because it might get hurt. And Anhingas have a very dagger-like bill. So it comes up from behind, it sees that white and goes after it sees the light-colored tail tips and goes after that. And all it gets is the tail. And so occasionally we see Anhingas with no tail feathers. They don't molt all of them at once. So when they've lost all of them, it's usually to an alligator.
Oh, wow. So we have another question. Do live oaks shed leaves?
Of course, but not all at once. They shed them slowly, so they're evergreen. They remain with leaves on them all the time, but they do shed them and replace them.
That brings up an interesting point, because this is Marlene. A lot of times I hear people saying that they say this incorrectly, that trees should not be planted around the ponds because they shed those leaves, and those leaves go into the ponds, and that creates ugly ponds and issues with the pond. Do you have any take on that, Dr. Jackson?
I can give you my perspective. I don't think that the leaves are hurting the ponds from a biological point of view. From a biological point of view, they're doing something else. They're shading the pond, and that shade is important, particularly in South Florida, because of summer heat. Many of our ponds are relatively shallow, and the water heats up relatively quick, and it reduces the oxygen that's in the water and kills the fishes and things that are living in the water. So having the trees hanging over the pond provides some cooler areas and reduces the overall heat load that the pond has.
So I love this question by Beth Workman. Will you be giving tennis lessons to the folks so that their tennis balls do not end up in the pond?
I don't know. Years ago, I played tennis a bit and got a frozen rotator cuff, and that ended my tennis days.
Hey, I have a question. I think this one might go to our wet plan team. What is the organization that certifies companies that service ponds and lakes for environmental quality? It was mentioned in the January Zoom presentation.
This is Andy Tilton. I don't know about particular certifications other than the companies need to be licensed to apply chemicals and things. That licensing requires some continuing education for renewals. And so those certifications they would have to get to continue their licensure. But as far as some kind of a professional organization or a contractors organization that certifies them, I don't know of anything like that.
I know that there's a company who certified golf courses for best management practices. The company is called Audubon International. They stole the name Audubon and they put it in because there's no copyright on the word Audubon and on the name Audubon. So they're using that Audubon, but it's nothing related with the Audubon Society. So, but they use and they do this certification for golf courses if there is certification for that purpose.
Yeah, I know the organization. There was a big lawsuit over that name use, which I guess Audubon lost, but but it was, and I'm a little bit familiar with the company, in that yes, they are golf course oriented and not so environmentally friendly. You know, they do some things that are good, but some things that aren't quite so good.
I got a quick question, if I may, to Dr. Jerry Jackson. Is that what is your theory behind the reason for the knees in the cypress? Why, you know, the cypress has knees, and
yes.
what is the purpose of that?
Oh, good question. And I talk about this a lot. Cypress knees are outgrowths from the roots of a cypress tree, and they never become a tree. They never produce limbs or anything like that. And they occur if you look closely following a major hurricane, you'll start seeing new cypress knees coming up. And you can always identify new cypress knees because they're red on top, rusty color. And that's a sign that they're growing. And the old ones are going to be dark brown and bark colored on top. And you get a lot of them coming up right after a hurricane. And that's because of the strong winds blowing on the tree. They're hitting the tree from whatever side, and it's hitting the top, and that's causing the tree to bend over. It's being pushed over, and it's tugging on the roots. So it's pulling the roots through the soil, and it is the abrasion between the soil and the top of that root that's being tugged that stimulates the beginning of a cypress knee. And the cypress knees then are going to provide sort of an anchor that will, in future storms coming from that direction, will hold the tree steady in place, keeping it from blowing over. So the cypress knees are going to come up on the side of the tree that is most was hit by the strongest winds. You can tell the direction the storm came from later by looking at the Cypress Knees where they are.
So Caesar Peralta said he's interested in hearing about your trips to the Caribbean, and please add me to your email list. I'm not sure if you meant your email list or ours, but is there a way for people to follow you, Dr. Jackson, if they're interested in more of your talks?
I don't have a blog. I don't have a website. I have an email address, and I'd be happy to respond. And if I don't respond immediately or within a day or so, try me again, and I will respond. I'm always busy, always doing lots of different things, and I'm getting forgetful sometimes too. I just get tired of dealing with all of the junk emails that I get. So I don't go my email, but I do a lot now.
So you could put your email address into the chat for us.
Yeah, I'd be happy. You can just put it in. You've got my email address, don't you?
Yeah, we can put it in.
It's probably online through FGCU. As professor emeritus, I still have an office at FGCU. I still teach there and do research through FGCU. I'm just not paid.
Well, we're glad that you still do that, because we're all so happy to have your expertise and hear you on WGCU. So here's a few more questions. Beth Workman asks, are there certain species of littorals that absorb more nutrients than others?
Probably so. I don't know. That's not one I can answer right off.
Do you know if Cypress Knees do any breathing for the tree? That came from Connie Langman.
That was an early theory, and there is no evidence that they do that. They're not pneumatophores, which is what the structure that some of the mangroves have.
So someone's asking, why are there always ducks and other birds around pond fountains? Do fountains attract wildlife? How can they impact the water quality?
How can ducks impact the water quality? Well, if you have Muscovy ducks, which are ducks that were introduced to Florida by the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission, they're an exotic invasive from Latin America, and they were introduced long, long ago for the poor deprived hunters of South Florida who didn't have much duck hunting down here. And they raised them in Naples at the site of the Naples Zoo, and got a population big enough. They turned about 100 or so loose over in the Fish Eating Creek area. And because they had grown up in urban areas, they all left, came back and began nesting in cities and towns. They are a domesticated duck. It's the only domesticated bird from South America. And they were domesticated long before Europeans were here. They got the name Muscovy because the Muscovy Trading Company, which was from Russia, got a bunch of them from the natives and began breeding them in captivity and selling them around the world, and they were called Muscovy ducks because of that. But yes, their populations continue to grow. They don't have the predators in the city that they have in the wild, and if their numbers get too big, their fecal material can do quite a job in polluting the water. I guess that was your question. That was my answer.
Yeah. Well, they were wondering too, do those fountains we have in our ponds attract them, or they seem to be attracted to those?
I have no idea. They might attract them in that the fountain that's out there sometimes has a little base, and they can perch on that. And they like to have the safety of something that's out in the middle of the water to rest on too. I'm thinking of a pond up in Maitland that has a nice fountain out in the middle, and it's literally got a little island out there that the fountain is on.
So this one might be for our wet plan panel. What is the best way to add plant diversity to a 2-to-1 lake bank slope? I don't know if Ernesto or Marlene or Andy want to field that one.
That's a tough one, if I may say, because the 2 to
Sounds
1
like
is
a pretty steep slope to plant anything on.
Yes,
correct. The plant's probably the one that you mentioned, the alligator flag, will be something that it will be able to stand on those slope and then, yeah, and probably make it. All the other plants are probably very short.
That's a hard one.
Yeah, and
That's a hard one.
perhaps trees or shrubs would actually shore up that slope and maybe keep it from becoming even steeper or becoming an escarpment.
Mhm.
So Sherry Fernari says, is it generally safe for humans to eat fish caught in stormwater retention ponds?
It depends on where you are, I would say. If there's a lot of runoff from highways or roads nearby, if there's a lot of use of pesticides in the area, you know, once a week may be okay, but more than that may not be.
I would not recommend it because there's a lot of heavy metals that are in the parking areas that they run into the pond, even in the homeowner association environment, they will have some heavy metals there, and it bioaccumulates. So by the time the fish eats a little fish, they are bioaccumulating there. So I will not recommend eating it. It's fun just to catch them and release.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Dr. Jackson, about one of the early slides in your presentation, you showed Westlake at Eagle Lakes Park.
Yes.
And it was a beautiful wildlife pond, but I couldn't help but think that if homes were built around that, people would be going bananas about stuff floating on the water, and they would want it treated, chemically treated, and somehow cleaned up because they would find that a mess. Do you have any advice for somehow bridging this brown ringed stormwater pond with a Westlake type pond that homeowners could be okay with living around?
Well, at that particular lake, on the west side of that, which is the west boundary of the park, there is an apartment complex, and I doubt that there's much negative coming from that apartment complex relative to what that is like. There's a nice sidewalk that goes along the edge of the pond, and the vegetation has been allowed to grow. So there's very dense thicket between the pond and the apartment complex. The pond is literally invisible to the people there most of the time. But no, I wouldn't have any suggestions except that they may clamor for, say it's going to breed mosquitoes. And I can assure you that because of the wildlife that's there aren't going to be many mosquito problems there. There may be some, but.
Well, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much. We have about a minute left, so I think we'll move on to our closing, but we really enjoyed your presentation and appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed it too, and I hope to meet some of you in person one of these days.
Yeah, and I did put your email into the chat so that everyone can have it.
Okay.
So if you have a question for Dr. Jackson, feel free to email him. we just wanted to let you know before we go that coming soon, the wet plan program is going to be having a Lee County pond contest. So there's gonna be a couple different choices. If you have a great pond, there's gonna be a contest for you. And if you need a bit of a pond makeover, there's gonna be a contest for you. So keep your eye on the website and our emails and updates, and we'll let you know more details about that in the very near future.
That sounds like a really great idea.
Yeah, we're excited about it.
Good.
And then we wanted to remind you to visit our website, www.wetplan.org. This presentation and our other presentations are posted there online. We have a YouTube site that has all sorts of video resources, and there's other resources at wetplan.org. And if you have a question, email us at wetplaninfo@gmail.com. And with that, it's 12 noon, and we're going to end our program right on time. So we thank you all for joining us, and thanks again to Dr. Jerry Jackson.
Thanks,
And
Dr. Jackson.
we'll be seeing you soon at the next Wet Plan Pondside Talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.